From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, and I'm Barry Howard, and welcome to another installment of the Library of Congress National Digital Information and Infrastructure Preservation Program Briefing Series. We have a special guest today, Eric Price, who is currently a postdoc at the IBM Almaden Research Center. This fall, he will become a University of Texas at Austin professor, and he received a Ph.D. in computer science in MIT last year. His research has been featured in Technology Review's list of 10 breakthrough technologies of 2012, and his thesis received a George M. Sprowls Award for Best Doctoral Thesis in Computer Science at MIT. So Eric will talk about NewsDiffs, the go-to website for referencing silent changes made to online news articles, whether on Twitter, Reddit, or the New York Times Public Editor's blog. He will provide examples changes found on NewsDiffs, as well as the research opportunity presented by its trove of data. So just a couple of logistical things. If you would please silence your phasers at this point in time, and out of respect for our speaker. And we will have a question and answer session afterwards when he's finished with his presentation. And given that we're recording this for a webcast, we generally the Library of Congress has a production workflow, and then this will be up online in like a month or so. But if you would like to contact me directly to know when it's announced, I have business cards I can share with you later on, and then and I can actually tell you when the webcast is up at a later date. And so without further ado, here's Eric.
Thank you, Barry. I'm glad to be here. And while there will be a Q&A at the end, you're also encouraged to ask questions in the middle as well. So feel free to break in and ask questions. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about NewsDiffs, which is a project I did a year and a half ago. So basics observation is that online news is different from print news in a number of ways. In particular, one way is that in print media, there's the daily deadlines, and if you want to change your news article, then it's kind of embarrassing, kind of annoying, and so you have to, if you confuse Twilight Sparkle with Fluttershy for your My Little Ponies, then you have to have something that's on the second page of the newspaper with this correction that everyone can read. And for online media, instead, the deadline isn't every day. It's right now because you're competing with all the other online news media, and you want to put it up as soon as the breaking news happens. But it's much easier to change. And so it's better. So for online news, you're much more likely to put things up that are half-baked that you're going to fix later. And so online news articles have this life cycle where the reporter will write a rush story about some breaking news. So this is an example of a story. And then it'll be put online before even the editor makes a pass. And so then the editor will make a pass and say, oh, we don't use that word, we use this other word for this stuff. And it'll make minor changes going through. And then either the same reporter or another reporter will rewrite the story. It's called a write-through, where they just, they use some of the same text, but mostly just rewrite it using more time and using more information. And it'll be posted a few hours later. And then again, this is posted before the editor actually looks at it, and the editor will look at it later and fix up the text. And so previously, you would just see this last version in the newspaper, but now with online media, you can record all these different versions. And so if your library just stores the archive of this last version, the one that actually makes it into print, it's not really storing what people were reading, because people are getting their news mostly online, and they're seeing likely one of the intermediate versions of the article. And so NewsDiffs is a way to track what the different versions were as they evolved. So it's newsdiffs.org. Probably some of you have looked at it before coming to this talk. Basically, there's one page that shows for various articles, like the set of different versions that they've had. So here's one article with 3 versions, another article with 4 versions, one with 10 versions. And then if you click on one of the compare links, you can see for a particular article in red and strike through it is what was deleted in the previous version from the previous version, and green is what was added in the new version. And so some text is preserved, some text is removed, some text is added. And so the structure of this talk will be, I'll start out describing the motivation and the creation of NewsDiffs, and then I'll describe some of the more interesting articles that we found when tracking during the time that NewsDiffs has existed, and then I'll describe what I'd like to do with NewsDiffs in the future if I had infinite time and resources. And then there's a Q&A, but you're welcome to ask questions at any time. So yeah. So for the motivation, one of the motivations, so this was before NewsDiffs, during Occupy Wall Street, there was an article on the New York Times about some protesters on the Brooklyn Bridge that started out with the lead being, after allowing them onto the bridge, police cut off and arrested dozens of Occupy Wall Street demonstrators. And then, as is common, there was a write-through of this article. And in fact, the set of authors changed. So the new author was added and wrote much of the article. And it rewrote the lead. In particular, it didn't have the first, like it was a different sentence, but it didn't have this implication that the police had entrapped the protesters by allowing them on and then cutting them off. And the only way that you could notice, and so somebody wrote this lurid claim and posted it, and it got some amount of social media attention. But the only way to make this observation that it had changed is that someone happened to have still preserved the old thing, likely in a different tab. And the reporter says, well, okay, the lead changed in tone, but the article as a whole didn't really change. It was basically the same. The new article still had the same text in it. And it's really hard to judge that kind of claim because we don't have access to the old text. There's no way to look at that and compare what happened. So that was one motivation. Another motivation is Nkisi the telepathic parrot. So this is a BBC Science article from 2004 that was on this parrot who was a brilliant parrot, had a 700-something word vocabulary, and whose abilities, which are said to include telepathy, featured in the latest BBC Wildlife magazine. Now, this got some amount of ridicule. And so in 2006, they just removed that clause. So they kept the same article with just the telepathy excerpted. And there was no correction, just silently improved the article. And then this again got some attention. So I was following this on language log at the time. And in May 2007, they just replaced this article by a different article on animal communication. So it talked about dogs, it talked about monkeys. It didn't actually talk about parrots at all. And again, there was no notice until a couple months later in August, they added a correction saying that this derivative animal communication replaced an earlier one on this page which contained factual inaccuracies they were unable to correct. Yeah. So as a result, the original story is no longer available. It is still visible on elsewhere via a link to the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine, which is how I can get this timeline and know exactly what this story is. And so this is great that I can go to the Internet Archive and I can see what happened to this article. But the Internet Archive isn't really designed for news articles. And so you can only do that in this case because they were so slow to correct this statement about telepathy. And so an Internet Archive will trolls the entire web every month or something, roughly. And so because they took months to do these changes, you can see what the intermediate stages were. But also, and most articles don't have that slow timeline. The other issue is that the page styling changed over time. And so it takes a lot of work to see what changed in the text versus they just changed the ads or they changed what their frame of the web was, etc. And so NewsDiffs is designed to do this sort of thing, but more cleanly. Another motivation
which we actually weren't aware of before creating it, is a year before NewsDiffs, the public editor of the New York Times, which is sort of the ombudsman, wrote an article saying that, on NewYorkTimes.com, now you see it, now you don't, about precisely this issue. That there were silent edits, lots and lots of silent edits being made to the website, and no real transparency about what's going on. And one quote was, "Right now, tracking changes is not a priority at the Times," as the new executive editor, Jill Aberson, said to me. It's unrealistic to preserve an immutable, permanent record of everything we've done. And so the point of NewsDiffs is that that's not true. That it's actually quite easy to preserve an immutable, permanent record of things you've done. Version control is a solved problem in coding and like source control for computer code projects. And it's not that hard to do. So NewsDiffs, I guess the team is Jennifer Eight Lee, who was a former reporter for the New York Times, and then Greg Price is my brother, and then there's me, and Jenny was dating Greg at the time. Yeah. So there was this Night Mozilla Open News hackathon that was held at MIT, which is where I was a grad student. So it was held, I guess, over there, and my office was there, and I lived right there. And so when Jenny came to town for the hackathon, she slept on my couch. And then she dragged me to the hackathon. And so when we were trying to figure out what to do, I was like, I remember this telepathic parrot, and she knew about this Brooklyn Bridge thing. And so we came up with the idea of NewsDiffs. And so the hackathon, you code for a while. And so the next day, we had our working prototype of what to do with the old name, NewsDiffer. So this prototype basically worked to say that it's not really unrealistic to have an immutable permanent record. Like Wikipedia has this of everything they've done, and it's you just install Git, put everything in your version control system, and you're good. And so we did it in roughly 1 weekend from the outside, and it'd be easier to do if you actually had access to the internal things rather than having to crawl the web page to know when things change. So technical overview, which maybe some of you care about, is so you have some scraper which goes to NewYorkTimes.com and says, oh, let's store a database of all the articles that appear today or at all times, and then you repeatedly go to these URLs and you parse the page to get the article text. And you store those. We store it in a Git repository, which is a version control system. And so then this is just a store of everything that they've done. And so you can have a web page that knows what articles you have and knows what text you are, and then displays it to you. It's pretty simple. And then diff match patch is the way that we have the pretty view of what's changed and what's the same with green and red. Now, when I said 1 weekend, that was a bit of an exaggeration because, as is typical whenever you talk to a startup, you have scaling issues, right? When you design something, it works when you have 100 articles. It doesn't work when you have 1,000 articles. And so you fix it until it works when you have 1,000 articles, and then you're going to run into more bottlenecks when you get 10,000 articles. And so every few weeks, or at sort of exponentially increasing lengths of time, we ran into other scaling issues and had to do another day of work to fix it. But it's not, in the end, all that much issue. And so we did some technical stuff to improve this, but it's not that much work. So we got some amount of press. So the first thing was from Pointer, and then the public editor, so here, after his previous article, says, oh, look, there's this NewsDiffs thing. And yeah. Right. And in fact, since then, the public editor, Arthur Brisbane left, and Margaret Sullivan is the current public editor. And so she has a blog that publishes every week or so. And fairly frequently, like every month or two, she discusses some change that they did on the website that readers complained about. And the only good way for her to discuss what the old text was
is to point to NewsDiffs and say, look, this is what the change was. And so that's nice. Right. And then the other thing is that lets us know what the interesting changes are. Because as I'll get to later in the talk, there's a whole lot of changes that happen. And most of them are like the changes I showed at the beginning. They're pretty minor. It's the standard routine editorial stuff and write-throughs. And it's hard to know which ones are particularly interesting. And the only way we really know how to do it is readers notice and blog about it. And it'd be great if we could change that. So there's also been foreign press. So here's, I guess, a Spanish site and a bunch of foreign press. So we're currently tracking New York Times, CNN, Politico, Washington Post. It doesn't take that much effort to track another website. It's fairly modular. You just take about an hour of writing code to get the new website to work. There's some resource constraint in that we're not spending any money on NewsDiffs. We're just using free MIT services for all MIT students. And the other issue is that, and the sort of the more important issue is, while we're tracking these 4 sites, people pay a lot more attention to the New York Times website than they do to the others. And so we actually only ever see the interesting changes to the New York Times website because those are the only ones that people notice. And if the Washington Post website changes, people don't tweet about it. And so we don't know, we can't find them. And so I think before we expand to get a lot more other sites, I think we need to figure out how to make it easier to find the interesting changes. It's also free software, so you can fork it. So there's a Argentinian site, which, as you can see, is pretty similar, except they're tracking La Nación. There's a Spanish site that's tracked, I guess, El País and El Mundo and abc.es. And there's people that are running it, I guess, privately, and so they've submitted patches to us that we can accept in order to track a German newspaper and such. Yeah. Okay. So we're currently tracking 80,000 New York Times articles and 220,000 articles overall. Of these, so when we first made this site, we didn't realize how often articles change. We're like, hopefully we'll get some changes over the next 24 hours during this hackathon. It turns out that actually most of our articles changed, or like half of our articles changed. And so, yeah. And this varies a lot by section. So it's unsurprising in retrospect, but if you're in opinion or books or fashion sections, then is not in this 24 hours news cycle situation. You have time to think about it more, and so only 20 to 30% of these change. While if you're in like sports or the world, then it's much more breaking news where you're going to be rewritten. So like sports articles will often be rewritten during the game all the time, and so you'll have lots and lots of changes. And so that's the change once. 14% have changed at least 3 times. And but only 9% have official corrections listed at the bottom. So, because their policy is they only do official corrections if there was a factual mistake in a previous version of the article. But if there's a change in tone, or if there's things that were not mentioned that are now mentioned, or things that were mentioned that aren't mentioned, or even if it's like, then they won't have a correction. And sometimes when it's kind of ambiguous, there still won't be a correction, and people will complain about that. And occasionally you'll notice that there was a factual mistake, but it only appeared online for like 20 minutes. It didn't get into print, and then they'll pretend that it didn't happen, basically. So one proxy for how many are like totally rewritten is how many have byline changes, which means that another author came in and rewrote the article. And those happen for 4% of articles overall. But this is more common in the world section for some reason, such that, yeah. I think in the world section there's something like the foreign correspondent writes it, and then the more centrally located correspondent will rewrite it with better English later on. Okay, so that is the basics of NewsDiffs, and now we'll get to the case studies. Are there any questions at this point? Yes?
What do paywalls do to what NewsDiffs
Well, for all the sites that we're tracking, oh yeah, the question was, what do paywalls do for what NewsDiffs does? And for all the sites we're tracking, the paywall is fairly loose. In fact, it's based on cookies. So like for New York Times, you can get 10 free articles a month and then you'll stop working. And in fact, the easiest way to write NewsDiffs is to not pay attention to cookies and not store cookies. And this happens to just work for to get through these paywalls. So.
Do you think it has anything to do with the fact that the site's hosted on an MIT server? And for example, the New York Times has said that, it has excluded certain addresses like edus.gov and other cultural and education institutions to allow them more access to their content.
So the question was, do I think that it has to do with being hosted on MIT servers and New York Times being more open to certain people with edu and .gov kinds of servers, kinds of addresses? And I don't think that's relevant. So I think what the New York Times does for that is if you have those kinds of email addresses, then you can get an account for free or cheaply. But this is just, they intentionally make their paywall very porous so that as many people can read it and then feel guilt into paying. Right, but like by default, their paywall would not block NewsDiffs because we don't store cookies. It's like we're just a new person coming in every time. Now, it is the case that they know what we're doing, and we're always accessing from the same IP address, and we're accessing the New York Times like every second or every 2 seconds. So I'm sure like it would not be unreasonable for them to cut off NewsDiffs. And I think at some point they've like decided either implicitly or explicitly that it's okay for NewsDiffs to exist, which I think is helped by the fact that they cite NewsDiffs every few months by the public editor. And also we are careful in our display not to display the entire website, the entire article, and only display the diffs to make that to improve our fair use claim.
When you were talking about all the foreign sites, were they using your NewsDiffs code and
Yes.
doing it for their newsdiffs? So there's no competitors who are doing the same thing you're doing?
So there is another service, News Sniffer, that does roughly the same thing we were doing. We found out about it after, but they actually started before us. And so they were originally doing it just for the BBC, and they have since added New York Times, and they do something pretty comparable to what we do. I think our interface is prettier, but.
Is there storage? Like, do you have storage issues for this? Do you collect all of these articles, and does MIT store them? And
Yeah.
will this get to be too big?
Right. So we've been going for a year and a half, and it's currently about 1 gig compressed. And but like because you want to do garbage collecting and such, we need like 4 gigs or so total of space, but it's still not that much. Yeah, because we're not storing images; we're just storing the text. And 220,000 articles. If each article is 500 words, that's roughly what you would get. Right? That would be a gigabyte of characters, and if you compress it, it'll be much smaller.
Maybe not to address this in case study, but
Yeah.
have you gotten feedback about people using it in education, journalism education?
I have not. No idea if people are using it in journalism education.
The 220,000 articles from the New York Times, what percentage of the New York Times does that actually cover? Is that 100%? Have you been doing it, or?
Okay, right. So the question was that 80,000 articles, in fact, from the New York Times. What percent of the New York Times is that? And we try to get 100%, but we don't try that carefully. So it's possible that we're missing a few, but it's close to 100%.
I had a question about the 9% that are given an official correction. How do you determine that?
Okay, so the question was the 9% that have an official correction. How do we determine that? And we have the text from all the articles, so you can.
Like a human has gone through 200,000 articles.
No, but I can I have all these articles on a computer, and so I can grep for correction : this article was modified with the following correction, and I can verify this. It is very simple. All right, I'll move on to the case studies. So the first case study is nuclear talks with Iran. So this was, the article started out saying, the United States and Iran have agreed for the first time to one-on-one negotiations of Iran's nuclear program, according to the Obama administration officials. And a few hours later, they they added a few words to the lead, and later on, saying they've actually only agreed in principle for the first time. And the White House publicly denied the report on Saturday evening. It's not true that they've done this, said a White House spokesman. And there was no correction, but it's a much weaker article with this claim than the original version. Yeah. The next case study, which was one that I actually found out about from my advisor at MIT. So it was an obituary of a rocket scientist that the original version was, she made a mean beef stroganoff, followed her husband from job to job, and took 8 years off from work to raise 3 children. The world's best mom, her son Matthew said. But Yvonne Brill was also a brilliant rocket scientist who did lots of cool stuff. And so this obituary appeared, and there was a fair amount of backlash, particularly in feminist blogs, saying, look, like one I remember had like a version of Einstein's obituary that started out talking about all his family life, and then, but he also got, right. So yeah. So there was a fair amount of backlash. And so they rewrote the article to not start off with her beef stroganoff, but actually what she's famous for. Yeah, and so like, as a scientist, one of the professors at MIT like noticed this and told my advisor about it. He's like, I could check whether NewsDiffs has this, and he like plugged it in, and yeah, we caught it very well. But also, the public editor, I think, blogged about this with link to NewsDiffs and such. Right, and again, there's no correction here, right? Because it's not a factual mistake. She did make a mean beef stroganoff, but like, yeah. So this is a more serious example. So this is the article we have with the most corrections of all the articles we've stored, which is the Boston Marathon bombing manhunt. So for those of you who remember, so there was the Boston Marathon bombing that happened in a Monday in April. And then on a Thursday evening, and it was relatively calm for a few days. And then on a Thursday evening, there was an MIT police officer who was shot. And there was a shootout in another part of Boston, and one of the bombers escaped. And Boston was on lockdown all day, and it was like really scary. You weren't supposed to go outside, and so there were a million people that were stuck inside all day that were anxiously watching the news or anxiously refreshing the news. And so whenever there was anything that new that happened, they would rewrite the article a little bit. And so there were 52 changes in a 24-hour period. Which in fact probably means there are more, because we only check it every 20 to 30 minutes. And this is basically the rate at which we were getting new versions. And so, like, you know, I certainly read the New York Times version of this article many times during that day. And it was significantly different. But if you were just going to get the print version, you'd only see the version at the very end, which actually was after they caught the guy. Right? They only printed the version after they caught, which was after like 11 p.m. when they found him. But most of the people, like lots and lots of people, were seeing it during the course of the day. So another example is the obituary of Edward Koch, who was a mayor of New York in the 80s. And so the original version didn't talk about his response to the AIDS crisis. And there were, a good number of people who were not happy with his response to the AIDS crisis and wanted this to be mentioned in the article. And so after some amount of uproar, they added 3 paragraphs that described the complaints that he got. And again, no correction because there wasn't a factual mistake.
It's 2 hours.
So this is a bit misleading because it's 2 hours between this and the previous version, not this and the first version. Right? So there's a previous revision that you could change. That might be the editor came in, made a pass. So you could go to NewsDiffs with this URL and you'd figure out what the total time is, but I'm sure it was more than 2 hours. Yeah. Are there any other questions on this stuff? All right. So this is an version from during the campaign. So I don't know how much you remember, but there was the Benghazi attacks, and then Romney immediately came out attacking Obama for what happened at Benghazi, and he did this in a ham-fisted way that like got some of the facts wrong, and so there was a backlash at him for second-guessing the commander-in-chief immediately before figuring out what was going on. And this is an article about that backlash. And so there were 2 articles that were basically different articles on the same subject that used the same URL. And so the first article was by David Sanger and Ashley Parker. The second article was by Peter Baker and Ashley Parker. They were different authors, and the tone was substantially different between these 2 articles. So the first article was much more critical of Romney. It started out saying, for a country looking to understand how Mr. Romney, a Republican candidate with no foreign policy experience, would respond to a major crisis, this is a first glimpse. And, as an advisor to the campaign said, it looked like he had forgotten the first rule in a crisis: don't start talking before you understand what's happening. Yeah. And so I'm sure lots of Democrats were happy to see this article and tweeted about it and sent this to all their friends. And then but then if people went to this URL a few hours later, they instead get an article that was much more he said, she said, that didn't have this quote because they replaced this quote with a less damaging quote by a named source rather than an anonymous source. And so the person that would follow this link and got to this he said, she said article would be like, well, okay, what's so exciting about this article? Yeah. All right, so those, I think, are my case studies. Are there any questions on them?
So when you say people notice what's interesting, they notice it when they're reading. They don't know. Do they notice it from NewsDiffs, or they
No.
notice it?
So it's like, so for this example, it would be someone did really like this article and then looked at it later and it wasn't the same, and they're like, damn. And then they might go to NewsDiffs and see what the change is.
Email the site, say, go look at this, and then their friend looked at it and said, what are you talking about?
Right. So for this one, it's pretty clear how this would happen. For this one, it was okay. People complained about it, which is why they changed it. Is how you know what happened. For this one, again, people complained about it, and so they noticed when it came about the first version. They noticed when it changed. For this one, I'm not quite sure how people noticed the change, but certainly someone noticed the change, and then like we found out about it, I think, because the public editor blogged about it and pointed to NewsDiffs when doing so. Yeah. And there's other examples that have been blogged about and tweeted about and such. Yeah. All right. But, like, what we would like to do for NewsDiffs is really 3 things. So one is what it's currently doing, which is just a reference for known interesting changes. If you find a change and you want to see exactly what it was, or you want to refer to it, you can go to NewsDiffs and cite the change. But it'd be nice if you could find the relatively interesting changes on the site. And the problem is there's only maybe a few dozen particularly interesting changes over the last year and a half, and we have 80,000 articles, and you don't really want to be looking through thousands of articles to find the interesting changes. And so we need to find some way of making that be better. And the third thing is, okay, we have all these changes, and on their own, they're not that interesting, but you might be able to look at the trends of how editing happens and get something interesting out of that. You could study what editing is about and what things reporters tend to do that editors tend to change, what things, I'm sure there's lots of things you could answer there, but I'm not a journalist and don't really know anything about journalism, so I don't know what questions are really the good ones to ask there. And so currently we only satisfy the first goal, and it'd be nice if we could satisfy the other two. So need to have some automated tool to go down from searching through 80,000 or I guess it's probably more like 150,000 changes to at least a small fraction of that a person could go through by hand. And the other thing is we'd like somebody who actually knows what questions are interesting to ask to use our data and find the interesting changes. So this is a change that I thought is kind of interesting in a simple example of a kind of study you could do, which is, okay, which is when to use that versus who, and when reporters make a mistake, or like when editors overrule the reporters in what you do versus between that. So consider the two sentences. The council could choose a pope that all factions would recognize, and the council could choose a pope whom all factions would recognize. Which do you think is better? I think it's that, personally. I think it's much more natural to say that. However, the editors say it is whom, which seems awfully formal to me. And so then you can ask, okay, so in particular, there was an article where the reporter wrote that and the editor changed it to whom. And you can ask, okay, for what kinds of sentences does this happen, that it gets overruled? Because the rule they have is that who refers to people, that's non-people. And it turns out that it's really quite common that this happens when the reporter is talking about cute animals. So Mitik, the baby walrus, who was orphaned, and the giant panda cub, who died, and the subatomic analog of cats, who were alive and dead at the same time. For all of these, the reporter wrote who, and then the mean editor, did not want to anthropomorphize these animals and change them to that. Yeah. But I'm sure there's more substantive examples of things you could find in the stuff we have. Right. So that is basically the talk. I think it's kind of a hack for NewsDiffs to be coming from the outside looking at these views. It would be nice if online you could go and see what the previous versions of the articles were. If it were transparent, so you didn't have to have this external source that is not maintained particularly much because it's not my day job. But in the meantime, NewsDiffs can fill the role. And if anyone's interested in looking through this data, I'd be happy to collaborate or give you their data. Thank you. Yes.
I don't see that the newspapers are going to do this because you're doing it for them for free. They would have to hire a staff to do this, right? Have you gotten any kind of feedback like that? They're thinking about doing this themselves?
So the question was, why would the newspapers do this if you're doing it for free? And have I gotten any feedback about them doing this themselves? And I've gotten feedback from a Scandinavian newspaper that an IT guy at this newspaper was excited about doing this and was planning on doing this. I don't know whether they actually got it done. I think it's more likely that they'll do it now that we brought attention to it than that they would if we weren't bringing attention to it. And maybe we need to make it be more broken. Maybe we need to go away, and then it'll be clear that we're not doing it for free. I'm not sure what the best way to push them to do this would be.
Are you planning on adding more sources other than
Right. So the question is, are we planning on adding more sources? And I'm not really eager to add more sources until we figure out how to find the interesting changes, because in my experience, we're looking at 4 different sources, and I've only ever found interesting changes in the New York Times because That's the only one where I've seen tweets or blogs about the interesting changes that have happened. And so it wouldn't be hard for me to add 10 more sources and get the data from that, but I'm not excited to do that.
So in the beginning you did have sort of an outline of the journalistic process for editing. Was that based on Jennifer's experience or just on what you were seeing patterns in the data already?
So the question was, I described an outline of how the editing process works at the beginning of the talk. Was that based on on Jennifer's experience as a reporter or on my experience just looking at NewsDiffs? And it was based on just my experience looking at NewsDiffs. But Jennifer has seen this talk and did not complain when I said it that way.
You mentioned that it goes back to the individual, it does a check every 20 or 30 minutes.
Yeah.
That's something you customize for different sites? And do you know of any outages when you weren't capturing that in that kind of increment?
So the question is, I mentioned at some point that we check every 20 minutes. Do I know of outages, and is that customized? And so it's not customized per site, but it is, for each article, it's 20 minutes when it's been actively modified. But then as if it hasn't been modified in a day, then we only check it every day or something. And so the longer it's been since it's been modified, the longer it is until we check it again. And there are definitely outages where things go wrong and I don't get to it for a day, or I don't notice for a week even. I think there was one outage of a week. Yeah.
When you see people cite examples from the site, how permanent is the reference? Like, for example, if someone came back and you said, oh, I see that there was some reference to this site changing, could they go right back to the exact point?
Yeah.
That the first listed?
The question is, how permanent are our URLs? And the answer is, we keep them permanently. Like, this is what you're supposed to do with URLs, is keep them the same. And so for instance, there was some point when we re-architected it to have new URLs, and so we made the old URLs redirect.
And you're pointing back to the original articles?
Yeah.
So do you have any records on those original articles going away or change? Like, are you monitoring the stability of their
Right.
articles?
So, okay, so the question here is, okay, our URLs may be permanent, but what about the URLs on the news websites? And we're not, like, I don't think we would do a good thing if the URL on the website changes. And there actually is an issue. So for the Boston Marathon bombing, they actually have two different article URLs that are now the same URL, the same article. And I'm not sure exactly what the process was there. And we're tracking those as two different articles, even though they're now the same article.
Do you keep track of independent voices, people who have a reputation for truth and veracity, who may not be published from time to time because of truthful statements that they make? Do you ever do anything in that area? Track truthful voices, like, for example, Seymour Hersh. He wrote an article recently about the sarin use in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And his article appeared in the London Review of Books rather than in the New Yorker or in the New York Times. And basically he said that Obama lied to the American public.
Yeah, so the question is, do we keep track of independent voices? And the answer is, we don't track people, we track these 4 websites. And if they get published in the New York Times, then we'll track them for that article, and if not, then we won't.
I guess there's a lot of chatter on the websites, a lot of conversation. Do you capture, would that highlight at all where things have changed? Would people ever comment on the site, on the New York Times?
Yeah.
Would it
Right.
generate kind of a more intensive dialogue?
So the question is, there are comments on these articles. Can we use those comments in some way to figure out what's interesting and what's not? And it seems plausible. we're not currently even keeping track of the comments. It probably would be a good idea.
I'm curious about analytical tools. I know you said you haven't found a way to drill down to the interesting articles, but are there any approaches that you've tried that you found didn't work, or are there any kind of ideas that you have for the future that you'd like to see people to use to work with data?
Yeah, so the question is about analytical tools. Are there things we've tried or things we want to do to figure out what are the most interesting changes? And we haven't really tried anything. It's a bit it's complicated because the different case studies that I described have different natures in what the changes were. So like the Iranian example, it was just 2 words added that made a huge amount of difference. While for the Romney and Benghazi thing, it was complete rewrites, which happens all the time, but in this case, it was interesting. And so for the Romney and Benghazi example, you could try to use sentiment analysis, which is a buzzword in NLP that might be able to figure out, oh, the article changed in tone a lot. And I don't know if that would work, but it might. And maybe you could like have some feature. The advice I've gotten from NLP people is just, well, throw in all the features you can think of, and hopefully your machine learning will take it out. So the idea there would be to like, okay, so we need to get more examples of what are interesting versus not, and so you'd hire somebody, maybe Amazon Turk workers, or maybe just, or maybe just volunteer, and you'd get a curated list of 100 examples that are interesting, and then you try to do random NLP, and hopefully that would work. But I don't know. Natural language processing. But in this case, it would just be very basic features and straightforward machine learning, and maybe that works, but we don't know. Yeah.
Is the software is open access? Is the data?
No. Yeah. There are copyright issues there that we don't really want to worry about. Like, in particular, like the New York Times doesn't. The question was, the software is open access, is the data, and we don't really want to be publishing a copy of every article the New York Times has written over the last year and a half, because then they'd be more likely to shut us down. But that said, if you want to do a research project, then you could get the data.
So the software keeps all of the content, all of the entire article, not just the differences.
Yeah, so the software keeps the entire article because there's no other way to know when it changes.
Is somebody taking over this project now that you're going to UT? Is somebody
All right.
staying at MIT to do it? Or are you taking it with you?
I'm taking the project with me to UT, I guess. Or, like, I still have an account at MIT, so I can still host it at MIT, even though I'm not there anymore.
So every 20 minutes you go out and get a copy and you bring it down, you save it down, you do a hash diff, and then you throw it out, or do you keep all copies?
Well, if it's the same, so every 20 minutes we get a copy, or later, slower sometimes. And if it's the same as the old version, then we don't need to store it because it's the same. And if it's different, then it's a diff, and we need to keep it because we care.
Yes, at UT, where do your research interests lie, perhaps beyond NewsDiffs?
Okay, the question is, what is my research interest? And I do theoretical computer science, which is totally unrelated to NewsDiffs. But if you're ever interested in doing a sparse Fourier transform, you can also talk to me. All right.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.